there are plenty of classic horror games out there that need a remake. Dino Crisis, Parasite Eve, and so on. However, I've already done a video on that, and if you're interested, I'll leave the link to that video at the end of this one. With that being said, today I want to focus on a different way we can revisit some of our favorite horror video game franchises: sequels. See, not every horror game out there needs a remake, and in the cases for some of our favorite horror franchises, it makes more sense for us to get a sequel instead. So on today's episode, I want to shine a light on some horror video games that haven't seen a sequel in a while that I believe deserves to see one soon. Keep in mind that you won't see stuff like Dino Crisis on this list, as franchises like that I feel like deserve a remake over a sequel. You also won't see any horror games or franchises that have seen an entry within the last 3 years. Finally, I'm staying away from projects that have already been announced like Alyx 3 and Silent Hill F, as we know we're eventually getting sequels in those franchises soon. Before we jump into today's video though, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing for more content like this. Also hit that like button if you enjoyed today's topic. Finally, support Nerdspace Games directly by becoming a STARS member and sponsoring the channel. You can do that by heading over to my channel's homepage and clicking that join button. Anyway, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is my top 10 horror video games that really need a sequel now. Let's get it. Number 10, Prey 2. Prey is definitely not your traditional horror game. Hell, most would probably argue that it's technically not a horror game. However, if you're like me and you've played Prey, then I'm sure you would have found yourself more scared in moments in this game over some of the biggest horror games out there. Actually, a perfect example to compare this game to is BioShock. While they are not full-blown traditional horror games, both BioShock and Prey catch the players off guard with the amount of horror and scary moments brought to the table. The main reason for most of the scares in Prey comes from the enemies that you'll face off against, the Mimics. These creatures have the ability to replicate different items in the area, disguising themselves as inanimate objects. Then when you get close enough, they'll change into terrifying creatures of different sizes. Prey released back in 2017, so it hasn't been a really long time since we last saw this game, but fans that have played Prey have definitely been itching for a sequel soon. Unfortunately, last we heard from Arcane about a sequel to this game, we were told that currently there are no plans to make one, largely because of the sales of the original game. Despite what the numbers show, critically Prey was well received, and many blamed the lack of marketing for the flop of the sales department. Overall, it's a first-person sci-fi shooter with elements of sci-fi horror, and personally, I would love to see Arcane take another shot at this franchise. I mean, hey, I'm sure it can't do any worse than Redfall did, right? Number 9, Dead Rising 5. Some people easily forget that Resident Evil isn't the only zombie franchise that Capcom owns. Dead Rising is a franchise that has seen 4 mainline entries since its debut back in 2006 when we were first introduced to Frank West. Now lately, there have been a lot of rumors surrounding the fact that the original game might receive a remake soon, but honestly, I don't know if it really needs one now. Instead, I would rather see a sequel made, one of which is done better than the last entry we got with Dead Rising 4. Don't get me wrong, I don't hate Dead Rising 4. I just felt like it wasn't as good as, say, the original Dead Rising game despite having the return of Frank West. Personally, I would love to see the new Dead Rising game focus on a new protagonist and a new area instead of the typical mall setting. For example, I feel like a really good setting for a Dead Rising game would be a ski resort or something similar to that, so that it makes it feel different enough while still holding on to the things that made us fall in love with the franchise. But if you're a fan of Dead Rising, which would you prefer? A remake of the original game or a brand new sequel? Number 8, Clock Tower 4. Late last year, it was announced that we are finally getting a Clock Tower remake, and honestly, the success of this game could motivate the team to publish more Clock Tower games in the future. In the original game, Scissors Man was iconic and terrifying as the player controlled someone that was completely defenseless against this terrifying stalker enemy that inspired many more stalker enemies to come after him. While the sequels that followed were not as memorable or as scary as the original game, the franchise did deliver some different styles, including Clock Tower 3, that took a similar approach as classic Resident Evil and Silent Hill games, with a third-person perspective alongside fixed camera angles. Just like previous games though, Clock Tower continued to explore defenseless protagonists that had no weapons to face off against terrifying stalker enemies. The last Clock Tower game we saw though was back in 2002 with the 3rd entry, but honestly, in the age of where survival horror games are thriving, I could easily see the franchise making a comeback with a 4th entry depending on the success of the first game's remake. Number 7, Siren 3. If you were looking for a unique approach to horror games, then look no farther than the Siren franchise. With 3 games in the series, one of which is a reimagining of the first game, Siren features a unique mechanic called mind hacking. This feature allows you to see through the enemy's eyes, allowing you to see what they see. While a big part of this allows you to build strategies to help avoid them, it also adds a layer of fear to the game, as seeing yourself through the eyes of your enemy is truly terrifying. Like, imagine if you found a really good hiding spot and before moving forward you wanted to do a quick check as to where your enemies are. Then after mind hacking, the next thing you see is yourself hiding in the bush as you slowly get closer and closer on screen. That feeling of fear you get in that exact moment will never go away, trust me. Unfortunately, because it was never really a commercial success, the franchise only saw 3 games, with the remake of the first being the last one back in 2008. Still, with unique mechanics within the horror landscape, seeing a new sequel to the franchise would be iconic, and I would be all about it. Number 6, Half-Life Alyx 2. Similar to Prey, the Half-Life franchise isn't exactly what you would call a horror franchise. It's more of a first-person shooter game with moments of horror. Again, think Prey and BioShock. However, unlike those games, I feel like the moments of horror with Half-Life are definitely more intense than some horror games out there. Actually, I have one word for you: Ravenholm. Yep, Ravenholm is easily one of the scariest locations in video game history. I remember playing through Half-Life 2 and getting to that section of the game and then honestly quitting it for a while because of how truly terrified I was. And Half-Life Alyx was a new level of terror thanks to the VR capabilities. Most would argue that Half-Life Alyx is up there as one of the scariest VR games with titles like Resident Evil 7. So while I don't think it's a traditional horror franchise, I do think the games bring enough to the table to the point that I would consider them just as much of a horror game as, say, like Resident Evil 5 and 4. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at the last time we got games in the franchise. If we're looking at the mainline Half-Life games, then the last time we saw Half-Life 2 Episode 2 released all the way back in 2007, making it around 17 years old. The episode actually ended on a cliffhanger as there was an episode 3 planned, but sadly it was cancelled. However, if we had to pick one, I'd rather see a sequel of Half-Life Alyx. There are not really many AAA games out there on the VR, and Half-Life Alyx is one of the best VR games ever. Many people are saying that the VR is dying. But if Valve can make another stunning VR game that's a sequel to that original Half-Life Alyx game that we got back in 2020, then we might see VR games saved. Maybe. Either way, the franchise could use any sequel, whether it's Half-Life 3 or a VR game in the form of Half-Life Alyx 2. Number 5, Bloodborne 2. When you think of FromSoft games, you don't normally think of them as being horror games. Yet there is one game that definitely meets that qualification more so than any other game in their catalog. That game is, of course, Bloodborne. Whether it's the terrifying gothic setting of the game, the themes inspired by H.P. Lovecraft, or even some of the terrifying monster designs inspired by Bram Stoker himself. Bloodborne is basically Dark Souls, but darker and scarier. It's actually because of the themes of Bloodborne why some fans of the Soulsborne formula would argue that this is the best game of the genre. Hell, some would argue that it's one of the best games ever made. Bloodborne released early in 2015, making it just about 9 years old. With that in mind and how much love the game gets even to this day, it would make perfect sense for us to get a sequel to Bloodborne. I know a lot of rumors have pointed out to the direction of a remake, but personally, I feel like it's more likely that we see a sequel. Bloodborne, while not the cleanest looking game out there, isn't exactly something that needs a major update in graphics like Demon's Souls needed. Instead, a sequel that kind of takes some inspiration from Elden Ring makes more sense to me. I don't want to take credit for this idea, as I know I heard it from somewhere, but I can't remember where, but Bloodborne 2 would be incredible with an open world similar to that of Elden Ring. Imagine that open world filled with the same themes inspired by Lovecraft and Bram Stoker. That world would easily go down as one of the best open worlds in video games, hands down. As for if we'll ever get a sequel, I think it's a lot more possible than most games on this list. But you gotta admit, open world Bloodborne 2 sounds pretty damn awesome, don't you think? Number 4, Left 4 Dead 3. Out of all the games on this list, I feel like Left 4 Dead is probably the least likely one to see a sequel. Valve has kind of forgotten about the franchise, and Turtle Rock went ahead and tried making their spiritual successor to the franchise with Back 4 Blood, which was met with some pretty harsh criticism. Honestly, it seems like it's the fans that keep Left 4 Dead alive, to the point where the community, with Valve's blessing of course, updated Left 4 Dead 2 with DLC that included new survival maps and even a new campaign back in 2020. Unfortunately, the fact that Valve approved this project meant that the chances of them releasing a full-blown sequel to wind out the trilogy were pretty low, but that's not going to stop us fans from hoping. While Dead by Daylight is the asymmetrical horror game that everybody knows about nowadays, the fact is that the Left 4 Dead games still carry the crown as the best asymmetrical horror games ever made in my opinion. And while the formula has been replicated multiple times with recent releases like Back 4 Blood, nothing has been able to dethrone the original Left 4 Dead games. Number 3, a Fatal Frame sequel. Despite us getting multiple remasters and HD versions of different games of the franchise, it's been a solid 10 years since we last saw a new Fatal Frame game, which honestly is kind of disappointing considering that some of the games of the series, like Crimson Butterfly, are arguably some of the best and scariest survival horror games out there. And while it's been pretty quiet on the new games of the franchise, just last year we saw the 4th Fatal Frame get a remaster. So with that being said, if the sales are positive enough for that remaster, then one would expect that the developers would get started right away with another entry to the Fatal Frame series, especially since, as I said multiple times, survival horror is on the rise right now, and capitalizing on that right now wouldn't be such a bad idea in the slightest. Still, if the remaster of Fatal Frame 4 went the other direction, then it's quite possible that the developers might just back off on making new games of the franchise for the time being. But Fatal Frame is a unique take on the genre as it puts the players into the position to where they have to use a camera to battle ghosts. Instead of running away or using guns to fight off the undead, Fatal Frame instead challenges you to face your fears head on, making it one of the most unique and terrifying experiences out there. So to get an official new entry to the Fatal Frame series after 10 years of waiting would be a massive W for fans of survival horror. Number 2, The Evil Within 3. In 2014, Bethesda, a publisher known for their RPGs, teamed up with a Japanese developer to bring us one of the best survival horror games ever, The Evil Within. This shocked the world as Bethesda wasn't really known for their horror games, but we were all pleasantly surprised to how well received this game was. 3 years following the first game, we got a second game which was even more successful in the eyes of the critics and fans alike. Unfortunately, it was this game that ended up flopping in terms of the sales, as it only sold a quarter of what the original game did at launch. Sure, over time this game will continue to build up on its sales, and perhaps nowadays it might be viewed as a small success in terms of the profits, but to learn that such a critically successful game actually flopped is kind of depressing to hear. But it may be the reason why we haven't heard anything about a third game of the franchise being published by Bethesda. Fortunately, with Microsoft now owning Bethesda, we could see them wanting to revive this game to help it compete with the survival horror heavy hitters out there like Resident Evil and Silent Hill. Hell, a game like The Evil Within 3 could easily win players over to the Xbox Game Pass and help them win the console wars, if you can call it that nowadays. Still, The Evil Within 3 could be a highly anticipated sequel that would win over new fans and old fans of survival horror, especially in a time where games of that genre are kinda just killing it in terms of sales. Unlike most games on this list, fans have only been waiting 6.5 years for the next entry, but that's still a pretty long time for a franchise that I believe is one of the best in its wheelhouse. Number 1, Alien Isolation 2. There are so many horror games out there that deserve a sequel, but one that fans have been waiting for a follow-up to for a really long time is Alien Isolation. However, due to the lack of sales, the chances of Creative Assembly and Sega releasing a sequel to that iconic first-person survival horror game are extremely unlikely. But that doesn't stop the fans from hoping and demanding a follow-up to Amanda Ripley's story. And while 2014 may not have shown any love towards Alien Isolation, seeing a sequel now when the hype for survival horror is at an all-time high wouldn't be a bad decision by Sega. One of the most incredible features of that original game was the AI behind the Xenomorph that would stalk you through the space station. The Alien had an adaptable AI system that will learn and improve based off of the way you play the game, making it much more difficult to outsmart this terrifying, indestructible creature. From checking lockers more often after you find yourself hiding in them a lot, to climbing through vents if you use them too much, the AI for the Xenomorph forced the players to think outside of the box every time they came face to face with this monster. It's a tragedy that we have yet to hear anything about a sequel despite us waiting 10 years for one, and despite it being one of the most innovative video games of all time. So between the mechanics and the cliffhanger ending we got at the end of the game, obviously Alien Isolation deserves a sequel more than any other horror game on this list. But that does it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know which horror game do you think deserves a sequel the most. Did it make my list or did I miss something completely? Let me know down below. Anyway, thanks for watching, and as always guys, I'll catch you on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.